It doesn't help that grading is my absolute least favorite part of this job. Right? I mean, even worse than dealing with my faculty when they're being petty with each other. As chair of this department, I really hate grading. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, then why don't you not do it? They give us all A's instead. Because if I don't put grades on things, as I mentioned, people don't do the work, right? Okay, we're going to talk about landscape painting, which is one of the things that happens in the Netherlands is that as this extraordinary art market develops with the wealth that's characteristic of the 17th century in Holland, we begin to see artists increasingly specialize in particular kinds of art. And you guys have probably encountered this in your own research on your work, that people do one kind of thing really, really well, right? And even within that, they might do a particular kind of thing very well. So Art van der Neer, it does only landscapes, but within that he specializes even further, really primarily in nocturnes, but also with some ice scenes, right? Hendrik Averkamp is a landscape painter, but he's really just kind of an ice-scape painter, right? And Vermeer is, right, primarily a genre painter. You've chosen one of two that are not, or four actually, because there's two historical scenes. But at the same time, there's something extraordinarily recognizable about Vermeer pictures, right? I mean, within those, even though he doesn't always do letter writers, readers, etc., there is something about the composition that's a Vermeer, and you see it from a mile away, right? So, with this idea of artists specializing, part of that is cornering a particular part of the market, right? Especially in Amsterdam, this is true. In Haarlem, it's a little bit more tighter knit, and then we get people like Rembrandt who tried to do everything, right? It's a sort of different business model, right? Where he tried to be all things to all people, right? And you also get artists who will do portraits as a way to sort of, feed the family, right? Because they bring in more money. Jorge.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say, like, wasn't there also a big economic crash like around this time, like 16 something, that made people repeat certain paintings to kind of specialize, not for these paintings, but in general for landscape.
I think the idea of repeating landscape forms is an interesting question that has a number. I don't think it's entirely tied to any singular event. To answer your question, the idea of repetition of landscape forms when we see it is on a certain level with landscapes very similar to the repetition of forms that we see with still life painting, or with genre scenes for that matter. Is that it's a way of streamlining production to meet demand, right? IKEAification, right, of things. You streamline the production to meet the demand. And that can also lower the costs, which means your works are open to more people, right? And certainly that is... there are a couple different business models. We think about art; it's a business, right? And that's why so many of our people, like Jan Steen, had secondary businesses, or Vermeer for that matter, had a secondary business. Is because it's very hard to make ends meet to this day as an artist, right? So we find a significant number of them kept a secondary career. And then there were ways around that business model, right? About how to do it. And one way is to get a wealthy patron who wants your works, and if that's the case, then you can sell only a few of them for a very good price, right? Especially if that person likes your work so much that they want to pay you to get first grab, right? And that was the case with Vermeer. He had somebody, right, who paid him for the right of first refusal. So sell a few things expensively, or sell a lot of things cheaply. And either way, you make the same amount of money, right? And if you're going to do the latter, then you got to figure out a way to make something good with less labor, time, cost, etc., in order to cut your overhead, right? And so this goes back to your question now. I am coming back. Right? It's not just the NyQuil talking. To do that, to streamline production, one of the ways to do it is to reuse motifs, right? Just sort of take them from one and put them in the other. You have a drawing you're going to use, and you're going to just reuse that drawing, right? So with the still lifes that we were looking at, if we play back the screencast that I put up for that, there is, in a lot of the Haida pictures, there's that silver taza. That's that wide stemmed silver dish with the nodules around the outside of it, right? It may well be an object he has. It may have just been a drawing that he made. It changes scale depending on the composition. Sometimes it's this big and sometimes it's this big, right? So the rumor, that's the glass sitting next to it, right? And the relationship of their scales changes picture to picture because he's not doing what we think he's doing, which is sitting in front of a table, right? Or if he is, he's really willing to change scales. More likely what he's done is he's streamlined production. He's made a bunch of drawings of different things that can repair time and time again. And the same thing holds true for figural painters, right? The same thing holds true for a history painter who might staff his paintings with the same sort of figures that we see over and over again, right? Same thing with landscapes, right? If you have a schema that you're following, it can streamline. So even though these two pictures by Bruegel, and this is kind of where landscape begins in a way. It begins earlier than this, but this is where we're going to start talking about, with Bruegel. There's a certain convention. And I think this is an important thing that the thing that's been happening for me with this class is getting back into Dutch art of the 17th century. After many years of not having really done much with it, is the degree to which conventions rule the day. An artist will take a theme and will treat it and retreat it, and as you look at them over time and make comparisons across artists, or even sometimes across genre pictures, different genres of picture, right? Between Mary Companies and landscape paintings, for example, between Mary Companies and group portraits, for example. You find these conventions just repeat. That what you see in one kind of picture, you just see it's over here as well. Right? And those conventions make it really interesting, I think, because they do speed the process up. We're still in your question. But at the same time, they also can be either an interesting assistance or an impediment to how we interpret the pictures. Right? They can complicate our lives, or they can make them more easy. As we go, like when we talked about my online thing, talked about this with the still life, or maybe in class we did. We talked about with the still life pictures, right? That we see the same sort of still lifes in those Mary Companies where it's all about moral choice and sex, right? But it's not necessarily certainly not about eroticism with the isolated still life, right? But is it still about complex moral decision making, right? And that it complicates it for us, right? Because these conventions cross boundaries. Right? So reading your papers, for example, with Margaret's paper on Vermeer's The Letter, right? To what degree does knowing about how letters were written or were shown in your picture versus Maeve's picture of a letter writer, how much does your knowledge of her Van Mieris picture change how we think about your picture and vice versa? Because the convention is being repeated across, right? So I think that's an important element of Dutch art, because part of it ties back to the open market, is the degree to which artists are extraordinarily conventional in the works that they're doing. And part of it is that they might have one of them hanging in their studio, that Jorge comes in, and pretend I'm a landscape painter. And you come in, and I say, well, do you like this? Do you like that? And I want one. Like, okay, fine. What are you willing to pay? And then for that I'll give you this, right? And I might have one already ready. I got one right here, Or I'll say, okay, come back next week, right? Maeve. my grads did this. I might have you guys do some methodological readings when we get back, right? So we won't do anything with others and have to read them in class for discussion, right? But get into some of these questions. But yes, this gets to this core of a debate that has been going on very strongly within the academic community studying Dutch art for the last 35 years. I'm not kidding, around 35 years. That is, what is the proper response, historically responsible response to Dutch picture? And it goes to the point that they are so extraordinarily realistic. For the vast majority of the pictures we're talking about, they are so extraordinarily realistic, right? What is the proper response? And is it, and this is a sort of slightly earlier but still dominant view, is the realism of the pictures not really the point? Is the point symbolism that is tied to the objects that are so realistically depicted? And does the realism then just sort of almost make it hard for us 21st century viewers to see them for what they really are? So, sometimes with Jan Steen, for example, it's very obvious, right? Those sort of symbolic meanings are very, very obvious. But sometimes with Vermeer, with Van Mieris, with other genre painters, it's not so obvious, right? What these mean, what does a map mean, right? Is it just a map he owned, or is it a reference to far-off lands? Is it a reference to patriarchy? Is it a reference to the past? I mean, these are all possibilities, right? So is there this emblematic or symbolic aspect of the different elements? Okay, that's one way of looking at it, right? And then with that, and going back to the start of your question, does it cross boundaries? You might have only been thinking about boundaries within art, but it crosses literature and art. Yeah. And very much so. And so the people that want to see a symbolic element to this cobbling together of these different forms, right? So we were talking about how still lifes and landscapes put together by, not accurately depicting what's in front of your eyes, but sort of choosing proactively to put things in there. The people that want to think that the elements that are chosen are not simply chosen for formal beauty, aesthetic purposes, right? But are chosen to sort of enhance, nuance, develop meaning. Those people would then look to, how can I figure out what kind of meanings they do, rather than what you and I might think. Oh, a bird means this. What did it mean to a 17th century, or in this case, a 16th century? And what they turn to is various types of literature from Holland. So for landscapes, for example, we can turn to Dutch poetry that talks about wandering around the landscapes and what it means to the wanderer, right? And help us understand that, right? And the sorts of associations they might make. So they would say, when we read those poems, one of the themes that we see running in Dutch landscape poetry and it's all really important to them because wandering the landscape was, for a couple of different reasons, it's sort of a new activity in the 17th century. One, increasing peace in the countryside, because the 80 Years' War, after the first 20 years, if you can't wander out in the landscape for fear of getting shot, then you're not going to do it. If it becomes peaceful, then it becomes get out of the city, right? Two, the land is the country, and they're reclaiming the land from the sea. So there's this idea of pride in what we're doing, right? That adds to it as well. And so when we look at landscape, when we talk about this new genre of poetry that's extolling this activity, right? Just praising this activity. And these are the wrong pictures to have up here for us, right? Because these are earlier. But sorry? No, Romanticism is 19th century phenomenon. It's a romantic outlook. But romanticism per se is something best left to the late 18th or 19th century, right? But one of the things that what they say, okay, so going back to what they say, right, how do we read landscapes, is one of the things they talk about is that wandering through the landscape is an activity that should remind us of our journey through life. That has its ups and downs, that you cross a bridge to the other side, blah, 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 right? And if we go back to, and this is kind of a romantic poet, right? Two roads diverge before me. Out of was it Frost, right? I saw two roads diverge. But you think about that, that's a perfect analogy, isn't it, right? Because you're walking through the landscape and you're thinking about life, right? And for the Dutch, this was the same thing in these poems, right? So going back now, again, one more step back, and then we'll move back into these. Let me just finish can I finish answering your first question, because I'm not done with that yet, and then we'll get to the second one? For you, in particular, with your term paper, right, with your resident expert work, there are a whole group of literature that are called emblem books, where people wrote about different objects and their metaphoric meaning. Not only was there realistic meaning, but also sort of symbolic meaning. And the most famous one, there are many, of these emblem books. So you just look at Dutch emblem books. Right? Jacob Cats. Spelled just like more than one cat. Spelled like the broad version. Jacob Cats. Is one of the most prominent emblem books that's used to sort of begin to dive into particularly genre pictures and say, oh, what is a bird in a cage all about? And you can find a little rhymed couplet that talks about the bird in the cage and what it means. Right? And so that becomes a nice analogy. That's a way in which it, going back to your first question, does it cross boundaries? Yes. Various kinds of literature, definitely. To music, even potentially, right? Anything that has a libretto. But also to other forms of art. Right? Certainly also to theatrical productions. Right? We have to keep that in mind as well. And then we have to remember all the things that we don't have any access to, which are the ephemeral parts of society, the things that don't leave traces, where there might be a record of something that happened. We don't have the details, and there are no sort of uprisings, right? Things that happen in the street that are recorded but not detailed for us, right? Keep in mind that a lot of those are recorded. So that's a lengthy answer made. Now you have a second question, so let's go with that, and then we'll dive into landscapes. Van Mander is one to sort of set this down, right? Definitely history at the top. I think so too. The portraiture tends to be, and the hierarchy is not necessarily an economic hierarchy, right? Although there was economic difference from high to low, the thing about that's mentioned about portraiture is that it's kind of the lowest because you've got it's commission work, exactly right, and so you don't get to decide the final work, right? So you're a portrait painter, and I paid you to make a portrait. I get to tell you how the portrait looks. You don't get to exert artistic license, except insofar as I prove it. And that being beholden to an outsider put portraiture further down, even though it probably paid better than landscape painting, right? Yeah. But with landscape painting, you have more leeway for artistic license, right? For creativity. Right? You don't have somebody saying, no, 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 you can't do that, right? So that issue of the nobility of the arts, right, is on many people's minds. We talked about it a lot with Rembrandt, right? Is on many people's minds. And so, but it doesn't mean that people who did landscape painting thought they sucked, right? It doesn't mean that they thought they were trashy people or anything. They just realized this, and many people suggested that many artists are trying to sort of meld genres, right? With the idea of breaking down this kind of hierarchy of different types of painting, right? So Frans Hals, who we looked at, right? With those incredible portraits, right? But they also are kind of quasi-genre scenes, right? Or at least they meld between them, right? There's a couple, we didn't look at them in this class, but there's a couple of portraits by Jan Steen that look like portraits, but they also look like genre scenes at the same time. So there's one of a man and his daughter, and he's deciding whether or not to give a beggar money. Right? And so it's a genre scene, but it's a portrait. So it's right? Rembrandt's Night Watch is both a group portraiture, but it's also an history piece. It's telling a story, it's telling a narrative. It seems to, right? Suggestive.
I was just gonna say that those those portraits that we found out, we just found out. When I first looked at them, I didn't think they were portraits. I thought they were genre
Yeah.
scenes. Like I wouldn't have guessed at all, especially the one with the father and daughter and
Yeah.
stuff like that. Like it looks like a genre.
That's right.
scene.
That's exactly right. And those ones with, when the guys lean over to talk to you, even those just those heads, right? There's something about them that's so immediate and visceral that it brings us in that it isn't. So we see artists like playing with these conventions, right? So let's sort of look at a little bit of how landscape develops. So as a separate kind of painting, right? As a separate type. So the word genre. Let's back up a bit. Let's just talk about terminology for a second. The term genre means type. Okay? So we talk about genres of music, right? Rock versus jazz. Okay? We talk about genres of painting, landscape versus still life versus portraiture. Okay? But then we have genre painting. Right? Which is the painting without a genre. So we call it genre painting. Does that make sense? It's just and it's not the term that they would have used. Right? Most of the terms that we use for these things today are not terms that were really well developed at the time. So still life painting, for example. I was just reading about this last night. When the publishing and the term still life was never even used in Dutch art until around 1650. In other words, the tradition was pretty in place by the time they actually used the term still life. And what terms did they use instead? They used terms like banquet piece, breakfast piece, right? Which is kind of a fascinating issue. It's like, how was it eaten? That's how the terms they use, right? And the same thing's true with genre. They didn't call them that. They would call it an interior piece. And so we have these terms that we use today that are universally accepted to describe these pieces, but they would have been foreign to somebody looking at it in the 17th century. They just help us to keep things straight, right? Okay, so now the genre of landscape painting. That's where I left off. That's where we back out of the labyrinth. We really begin to see it in the early part of the 16th century, primarily as the background to religious pictures. And what's interesting is that in the early 16th century, as the background to religious pictures, the religious figures, start to get smaller and smaller and smaller to the point where they almost like disappear and they're swallowed by the landscape. So that instead of having a figure in front of a landscape, you've got this landscape with a little figure in it somewhere, right? And it's usually very obvious where it is. It's usually in the foreground. It's not hiding or anything. But the landscape becomes increasingly important in those images, right? So the figure might be sort of the size of the hunters, for example, here. And artists already at that time in Antwerp, which was the primary art center of the early 16th century, which is down in Belgium, right? So it's not part of the Netherlands. Antwerp also had a really strong art market. It's one of the first places we really start to see artists begin to specialize. So we get artists who do that kind of specialty, landscape painting, right? And then Bruegel kind of comes into this situation later, right? And becomes I think an important touch point for 17th century Dutch landscape painting, particularly as it begins. And Bruegel's a major touch point. And the reason for this is that there were prints after Bruegel's works. So Bruegel's kind of landscape develops out of that earlier tradition, which I haven't shown you any pictures of, where we get a sort of bird's eye view. For those of you who took art history, think Bosch, right? Looking down on a world of activity, right? From a slightly elevated point of view. Bosch tends to put us a bit higher up, but still, where are we with the harvesters? The picture on the right's in the Met in New York, right? Where are you? You're on some sort of a 25-foot platform looking down on these figures, right? You're up in a tree for the hunters in the snow. Or looking out of a window or something like that, right? But you're not a ground bug. And the figures that we're looking at are even higher still than the background behind them, right? The hill drops off. And we get this view that seems to go on forever, just absolute sort of world landscape, as we call it, right? You can see as far as the horizon, and in each of them, Bruegel has filled with sort of a wealth of details and invites you to sort of pick your way around, right? And look at these things. So, Matt, your picture of that ice scene owes a ton to this, right? It owes a lot to this tradition because it's kind of doing the same thing, although we're closer to it, right? Picking up on this exact same idea. So we invited to work our way back. These are from a series of pictures, right, that were done to illustrate the months of the year. There were 6 paintings, each doing 2 months out of the year, right? And that's common for landscape paintings, even into the 17th century, to have sequences of images that would show us either times of day, times of the year, periods of life. Because again, landscape and life, right, were wrapped up together. Now, Bruegel became an important touch point because he worked for a publishing house in England. And he was making, in addition to paintings for clients, like the 2 months pictures we just saw, he was also making designs that were being given to the publishing house to make engravings and woodcuts from his designs, right? So these say in the corner, Bruegel created this, Bruegel invented it, and the publishing house, which is Hieronymus Cock, like male rooster, right? Published it, right? And you can see the same sort of construction, right? It's a convention again, where we have a rise in the corner, and we drop off to this distant landscape, and Bruegel fills that landscape with just a multitude, a wealth of wonderful, terrific things. And you just want to dive in with a magnifying glass, right? Ooh, look at that. There's a cow, right? And there's never any huge surprises. There's never anybody, something you wouldn't expect to see back there. But there's a certain joy in like looking at the little guy walking along the cow herd there next to the water, right? Or following the river back and you see the little houseboat sort of thing, right? There's a certain fun in doing that, right? And these give us what to look for, right? The penitent Magdalene in Latin. So where is she? And we look around, and it never makes it all that hard to find because she's right there. Right? But then we follow our way back, and we wonder if these figures moving through the path are related to that story or not. There is part of the Magdalene's legend where she's born into the air, so he gives us that. Here, the pilgrims on their way to Emmaus, and the question is whether or not we can find them, and lo and behold, there they are. Do you know the story of this? There's 2 pilgrims on the way to Emmaus meet a stranger. Does anybody know this? Book of Acts?
I've heard of the story.
Yeah. They meet the stranger. Who was the stranger? Remember? They meet this guy, they don't know who he is, but they're nice to him. Come with us, we'll give you dinner. Right? They take him out there, having dinner with him. Lo and behold, they realize he's Jesus. Right? And it's Jesus after the resurrection, so he's able to cloud his appearance. Right? This is all in the book of Acts. And he reveals himself to him and says, "You are blessed because you treated me, a stranger, with dignity, respect. Right? You gave me your own without knowing who I was." It's one thing to do it if you know he's Jesus. Right? Oh, I better do this. They did it out of the kindness of their hearts. So if we look at, and they've befriended this guy, and there's this really subtle halo on the guy in the middle. Right? So, but we see him from the back, so we don't, to you, he's also been, right? He's been disguised, right? But so the joy of these images is getting into them and looking. And you can see with these religious imagery the degree to which it really is just a landscape painting with a religious excuse, right? And this is very much the tradition that kicks off landscape painting in the Netherlands in the 17th century. Because a lot of these artists that had been working in Antwerp moved to the Netherlands. I remember Antwerp is part of the Spanish-controlled Catholic part, excuse me, of the Low Countries writ large. And after 1568, the outbreak of the 80 Years' War, the Spanish rulers of Flanders, the southern part, right, become increasingly intolerant of Protestants, right? And any artist who had Protestant leanings or faith in Protestantism fled up north where Protestantism was tolerated, in fact, accepted, right? So these two artists are brothers, Jacob Savary and Roland Savary. They both began their career working in Antwerp in the Bruegel tradition, right? High viewpoint, right? Little biblical story tucked in the corner as an excuse, right? The story of Jephthah's daughter. Savary's much more like those monks pictures we saw, where it's secularized, where there's a boar hunt, and it's too sort of nestled in the corner, right, lower right corner of this. They both moved in the 1580s from Antwerp to the Netherlands. Jacob wound up in Amsterdam, and Roland wound up in Haarlem, right? And they bring this tradition with them. It becomes the dominant tradition of landscape painting in just before 1600, right? In the Low Countries, having been translated there from Antwerp. Another artist who flees because of religious reasons, right? Leaves Antwerp for the Netherlands is Gilles van Koningslo, right? And here are two prints after his designs. And again, can you see the convention I'm talking about here, right? You get this sort of aerial view down over a distant landscape in which are nestled hundreds and hundreds of little details that we're supposed to look for. Not always human figures, but often that they are, right? So Moses, discovered by Pharaoh's daughter, is just off center in the front with that fancy plumed hat. There's a little, right? Moses was set adrift in a wicker basket on the Nile, right? And Pharaoh's daughter finds him. He's adopted by Pharaoh. In the Ten Commandments, right, it's Charlton Heston and Yul Brynner, right? Right. He's raised as Pharaoh's son before he and the Israelite captives, right, are part the Red Sea and go back home. Okay. So there is little Moses being found by Pharaoh's daughter, and how does our artist translate this into? It's certainly not Egypt, right? That doesn't matter. That sort of historical accuracy that you hear. Everybody moans and yells when movies don't get it right. Well, tell a good story. That's more important, you know? And so Pharaoh's entourage and his daughter are dressed as fancy-dancy 17th century folk, right? Very much like our Merry Company people that we saw before. And there Moses, we know from the little basket, is here, right? On the right is just a duck hunt, and we see the duck hunter, right? Crouched down in the bushes over here. He's got a gun. That's his dog. The ducks are just taking off here. There's a couple more there, right? And they're not the only hunter. There's a fox here as well. So it's just full of these really cute little details to dive in and look at. But these help to translate that Bruegel tradition, that sort of fantastic landscape, right? The aerial view, the distant alpine peaks. Look at this. Where do we find that? Anywhere in reality, right? These are fantasy landscapes that sort of natural arch. That's that large. It's like this ain't Utah, you know. The only place I've ever seen anything like that. These are fantastic created landscapes, and these become the norm in Holland right around 1600. And if we look at Goltzius, who we've talked about a number of times in Haarlem, because many of these artists, Koningslo ends up in Haarlem as well. Goltzius begins to adapt this tradition, or adopt this tradition. It's a bit more close up than the other ones, but you still have these sort of fantastic landscape elements put together, right? These jutting rocks, these amazing waterfalls. You'll figure this out next week, right? Holland is really flat. You know, you're not going to see anything approaching either of these pictures with the mountains in the background anywhere in Holland, especially this one on the right. Right? Landscapes like that simply do not exist. This is a fantasy landscape that Goltzius has given us here. In both of these, this is that chiaroscuro woodcut technique we talked about, where one of the plates is, or one of the wood blocks is the tone, and the other one is the line. In this case, it's two-tone blocks. You can pick up a sort of olive green and a yellow. Right? The one on the left is also two-tone blocks. So Goldsmith even begins to pick up on this same sort of mannerist landscape. And when we talk about I think I asked you what do you mean by mannerist landscape? Maybe it was Max. Well, this is what's referred to as mannerist landscape. It's coming out of Antwerp in the 16th century, and is a more fantastic kind of landscape than anything realistic or naturalistic. It's not to say that there aren't realistic elements in it, but the way in which it's been constructed gives no attempt to render a landscape that looks at all quasi-legitimate for the Low Countries anywhere, right? The interesting thing about Goldsmith is he also begins to do naturalistic landscapes. This is a terrific drawing, right? Now, it's just a drawing, so how much influence it had is questionable, because how many people are going to see a drawing versus a print, right? With the prints, he can make multiple impressions. Many people can see those. But he has 2 or 3 drawings where he's apparently gone into the countryside outside of Haarlem, maybe stood on the top of one of the we call them polders. Those are the rises that separate the areas where you've drained the water, right? And made sketches, or even perhaps just imagined himself in a Bruegel position. But as we look at the stuff that's in the landscape, it looks legitimate, right? That the dunes near Haarlem, that we can recognize it, that it's realistic. And at the same time that Goldsmith is doing this, what we find when we look at artists in Haarlem is that they begin to do naturalistic landscape in the beginning of the 17th century. Right? There's a phenomenon that happens right around 1610, right? 1605, 1615, right in there. Artists move away from the Bruegel tradition of fantastic landscapes to this new tradition of naturalistic, realistic landscape. And in Haarlem, we see it in a couple of different printmakers who do a series of prints of realistic landscapes. Some of them are identifiable places, some of them less so. So one of Haarlem's principal economic staples was linen, and they would bleach them in the fields using salt water outside of the city of Haarlem, and there are the bleaching fields on the left and this nifty little etching. Patter's Tavern on the right. But they're now focusing on a much more localized, right, much more realistic kind of landscape, beginning, like I said, right around 1610. A number of artists begin to work in this. Fischer does these wonderful things. What do we then do with them, right? And when we look at there's 12 prints in the Pleasant Places series, right? And there's a title page. They're not prints, right? They're meant to lead through the course. We think there's a kind of a narrative here, that the landscapes are sort of telling a story, that we move out of Haarlem and we work our way through the landscape, and the arrangement and the ordering of the things that we see go back to this idea I was talking to Maeve about the idea of landscape as life's journey, right? And the very last one in the series, the House to Kleef, which is in the background there, has all sorts of resonances for a 17th century viewer. It's outside of Haarlem, and during the siege of Haarlem, when Spain, during the 80 Years' War, had besieged the city of Haarlem, they used the House to Kleef as a watchtower. And when they were slowly defeated and driven out of the area of Haarlem, they decided to destroy the castle and leave it as a ruin, a Spanish ruin, which is how we see it here. So there's this patriotic resonance to this image, right? This is a ruin that reminds people of the Dutch triumph over the Spanish. On the other hand, it's a ruin at the end of our journey. And things that man builds die over time. Right? We begin to read these things as having resonant meanings, right? That one can tease out of them. If you spend enough time thinking about them and investigating what the artist has chosen to include. So landscapes take on a realistic element, but that doesn't mean that they don't have symbolic references as well. Right? And this is again, like I said, what I think Maeve was asking us about before. Another artist doing this also in, sorry about the pixelation. That's no better. Another artist working in these small prints of sort of localized scenes. It's just rife with charm. Asais Vandeveld. I think we looked at him before because he also did Mary Company pictures, images of people, tables, eating fine foods. But he's also a bit of a pioneer in landscapes, and there are again these sort of local customs, right? People that hadn't been really depicted before. The peasants in the countryside, the people living in these small villages and their activities, the kinds of houses they lived in, what they did with the river when it was a river, and what they did with it when it was ice, right? And the industry of them all, right? And I think because part of this is the marriage of the individual with the landscape and the industry that the Dutch can bring to it. Wonderful sheep on the bridge up above, the man skating with his sled to deliver his goods from one side of the river to the next. Right? They're just wonderful, charming images of reality now. Right? We've abandoned that brutal fantasy for something else. This really gets the ball rolling. Right? This kicks it off. And what we find from this point forward, right here at the very sort of beginning of Dutch landscape painting, that from this point forward, this kind of realism is really the thing. You'll get some people still doing fantasy landscapes because there's still a market for it, right? Roulant Savary, who we saw before, is a fantastic fantasy landscape painter. Continues to paint those sorts of things into the 1620s, right? Even some of the artists who start later will, from time to time, give us something filled with fantasy instead. Right? Even as realistic as these are, we have to remember that they are conventional. They are drawing still like painters through, right? From memory, from sketches, right? It's a composition rather than a mirror. Right? And the problem that confronts us still, that goes back to the questions from earlier, is because it's so realistic, we want to think it's realistic. We want to think it's actually an accurate reflection. But we need to remember that realism is part of the art's craft. Right? It's part of what they're bringing to the piece. Okay. Friday we'll look more at landscapes. We'll look at genres on Tuesday next. We only have 2 more classes before we leave, right? So I do want to make sure that we have time to sort of work out some last minute kinks on Tuesday before we leave as well. So we'll figure out how we handle this, right? And how much I want to show you actually here versus there. Right? But this sets the stage for thinking about what landscape's all about. And we can certainly have time to talk about them when we're there. Okay? Good. I'll get your papers back to you later tonight. Those of you who don't have them already.